The morning light filtered through the car window as Jamari pressed his face against the glass, watching unfamiliar streets roll past. His reflection stared back at him. A 12-year-old black boy with worried eyes and shoulders that seemed to carry weight too heavy for his frame. In his lap sat Bravey, a worn brown bear with one eye slightly askew and stuffing peeking from a poorly sewn seam along the left arm. His fingers traced the familiar pattern of Bravey's fur, the texture smooth from years of anxious rubbing, the only thing keeping his heart from racing completely out of control. "You ready, baby?" His mother Lorraine glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her voice carrying that forced brightness that mothers use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as their children. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Jamari didn't answer. His throat felt tight, words trapped somewhere between his chest and his mouth, like birds that had forgotten how to fly. He'd been through this before. New school, fresh start, same ending. The therapist said the anxiety would get better with practice, with exposure, with time. But time had only taught him that every new beginning was just another chance to fail at fitting in. Raya, his older sister, reached over from the front passenger seat and squeezed his hand. Her grip was firm, protective. "It's going to be different here," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of a 14-year-old who believed she could reshape the world through sheer force of will. "Mom's the assistant principal now. We're not just students here. We have power. Nobody's going to mess with us." But Jamari had heard variations of this promise before. Different school, same stairs, different hallways, same whispers that followed him like shadows. Different faces wearing that same expression when they looked at him. Part curiosity, part discomfort, as if his presence was a question they didn't know how to answer. A black boy who couldn't speak without his heart trying to escape through his ribs. A boy who needed a stuffed animal to make it through the day. A boy who was always, somehow, too much and not enough all at once. The school loomed ahead, all brick and glass and perfectly manicured lawns that looked like they'd been measured with rulers and trimmed with surgical precision. Too perfect, Jamari thought. Like a picture in a magazine where everyone smiled but nobody laughed, where everything looked right but nothing felt real. The building itself seemed to watch their approach, windows like eyes evaluating whether they belonged. Inside, the hallways smelled of fresh paint and floor wax, the kind of clean that felt aggressive, as if the school was scrubbing away any trace of individuality. Principal Wilkins stood in the main corridor like a lighthouse. Tall, pale, unmovable, his presence commanding attention without effort. His eyes swept over the entering students with the precision of someone cataloging inventory, noting which pieces fit and which would need to be adjusted. When those eyes landed on Lorraine, they narrowed just slightly. A subtle shift that Jamari might have missed if he hadn't spent years learning to read the smallest changes in expression that signaled danger. "Mrs. Hayes." Wilkins' voice carried the weight of authority mixed with something else, something cold that made Jamari think of winter mornings and locked doors. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Academy. I trust you understand the standards we maintain here." Lorraine straightened her shoulders, her spine becoming steel. "I understand excellence, Mr. Wilkins. That's why I'm here. To contribute to it, to uphold it, and to ensure it extends to every student who walks through these doors." "Indeed." Wilkins' gaze dropped to Jamari, then to Bravey clutched against the boy's chest. His lips pressed into a thin line, disapproval radiating from the slight downward tilt of his mouth. The principal's eyes lingered on the bear for a moment too long, as if memorizing it, as if filing it away as evidence of something. "I see your son has brought a companion to our first day." "Bravey helps with Jamari's anxiety," Lorraine explained, her voice steady but her jaw tight, muscles working beneath the skin. "His therapist recommended—" "We have policies, Mrs. Hayes. Strict policies." Wilkins interrupted with the casual authority of someone who'd never been contradicted. "Distractions in the classroom environment are not tolerated at Meadowbrook. We've maintained our reputation as the top-performing school in the district precisely because we refuse to compromise our standards. Surely you, as our new assistant principal, understand the importance of consistency, of not making exceptions." The pause before exceptions hung in the air like a threat wrapped in professionalism. "I understand that accommodating students' legitimate medical needs is not an exception, Mr. Wilkins. It's the law, it's decency, it's—" "All in good time, Mrs. Hayes. All in good time." Wilkins turned away, as if the conversation had already ended, as if his dismissal was a period at the end of a sentence that couldn't be questioned. "I'm sure you'll help your son adjust accordingly. We all must adjust to new environments, some of us more than others." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking. Jamari felt Bravey grow heavier in his arms, as if the bear itself understood the threat, the weight of what was coming. Raya leaned down to whisper in her brother's ear, her breath warm against his skin. "Don't let him take what's yours. Don't let anyone make you small." But as Jamari watched Wilkins walk away, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged, never been wrong, never been anything but obeyed, he wondered if he'd ever really owned anything that someone else didn't have the power to take. If being himself was allowed, or just tolerated until it became inconvenient. The bell rang. Students flooded the hallways, and Jamari held Bravey tighter, knowing already that this perfect school was going to try to perfect him right out of existence. The cafeteria buzzed with the particular chaos of lunchtime. Trays clattering against metal counters, voices overlapping in a cacophony that made individual words impossible to distinguish. Laughter sharp and sudden as broken glass. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow that made the food look even less appetizing than it already was. Jamari sat at the corner table. As far from the center of the room as physics would allow, Bravey positioned carefully beside his lunch tray like a small guardian. He'd managed to make it through 2 periods without anyone saying anything directly to him, though the sideways glances felt like tiny cuts, paper-thin but numerous enough to draw blood. In English class, he'd felt eyes on the back of his neck when he pulled Bravey from his backpack and set him on the corner of his desk. In history, the girl next to him had scooted her chair away, creating a buffer zone as if anxiety might be contagious. The teachers had said nothing, their silence somehow louder than any criticism could have been. "Is that your emotional support, teddy bear?" Jamari looked up. 3 girls stood over him, their formation deliberate, a triangle of judgment with him at the point. At the apex stood Becca Wilkins, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail so tight it seemed to pull her eyebrows up, her uniform pressed and perfect, her father's authority wrapped around her like an invisible crown that everyone could somehow still see. The other students seemed to sense the moment like animals sensing a storm, conversations dimming to watch, heads turning with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds changing direction. "It's—" Jamari's voice caught in his throat like a fishhook. He swallowed, tried again, his words coming out smaller than he intended. "It's Bravey." "Bravey?" Becca's laugh was practiced, designed for maximum audience impact, pitched to carry across the cafeteria like a stone skipped across water. That's absolutely adorable. What are you, 5 years old? Did your mommy pack him in your little lunchbox, too? The girls beside her giggled on cue, their laughter synchronized. One of Becca's friends, a tall redhead whose name Jamari hadn't learned, reached for the bear with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been told no. Let me see it. I want to see what a middle school boy's teddy bear looks like. Jamari pulled Bravey back against his chest, his breath coming faster, shallow gulps that didn't quite reach his lungs. The cafeteria was suddenly too small, walls pressing in, too loud, every sound amplified. Too many eyes watching him fail to defend himself, fail to be normal, fail to be anything but the anxious black kid with the stuffed animal who couldn't even speak without shaking. Leave him alone. Raya appeared like a summer storm, sudden, powerful, impossible to ignore. She slid her tray onto Jamari's table with enough force to make the dishes rattle. Her eyes locked on Becca with the kind of intensity that made people step back. Don't you have someone else to bother? Or is making 12-year-olds cry the only way you can feel important? Becca's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in her eyes. The look of someone calculating odds, measuring consequences, deciding whether the fight was worth it. I'm just being friendly. This is a friendly school, after all. We welcome everyone here. Right, girls? The emphasis on friendly carried weight, layers of meaning that transformed the word from greeting to warning. Her tone suggested that friendliness at Meadowbrook was conditional, a privilege that could be revoked, a courtesy extended only to those who knew their place. Friendly, Raya repeated, the word flat and sharp as a blade. That's an interesting way to describe cornering someone during lunch. Just making sure your brother understands how things work here. Becca leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to something that only their small circle could hear. We have expectations, standards, and people who can't meet them, well, they tend not to last very long. She straightened, her smile returning to full brightness, as if the threat had been a trick of the light. Enjoy your lunch, Jamari. Both of you. The girls walked away, their departure as choreographed as their arrival, leaving behind the kind of silence that felt like aftermath. Meanwhile, across campus in the administrative wing, Lorraine sat in her new office, staring at a locked filing cabinet like it held the answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. Budget reports, expense accounts, grant allocations, the financial heart of Meadowbrook Academy, and she'd been told the key was misplaced during the summer transition. Mrs. Hayes? Principal Wilkins filled her doorway the way weather fills a sky. Completely, inevitably. I trust you're settling into your new workspace? I'd settle in better with access to the school finances, Mr. Wilkins. Reviewing the budget is part of my job description. I can't effectively support you without understanding our fiscal reality. All in good time. All in good time. Wilkins stepped into her office uninvited, his presence shrinking the space. We have particular ways of managing our resources here. Ways that have served us well for many years. The previous assistant principal understood this, understood that sometimes institutional knowledge is more valuable than procedural access. Institutional knowledge doesn't balance a budget, Mr. Wilkins. His smile was thin as paper. No, but it does protect the institution. And right now, Mrs. Hayes, I'd suggest your focus should be on protecting your position here. Your children are just beginning to find their place at Meadowbrook. It would be unfortunate if complications arose. If unnecessary questions created unnecessary friction. Friction that might affect not just you, but your entire family. The threat was gentle as a knife wrapped in silk, sharp as a smile that never reached the eyes. That evening, Jamari lay in bed with Bravey pressed against his chest, listening to his mother's hushed, frustrated phone calls through the wall. Her voice rose and fell like waves, anger cresting, then pulling back, professionalism barely containing the fury underneath. Raya sat on the edge of his bed, her presence solid and real in a day that had felt increasingly unmoored. "Something's wrong here," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Did you see how everyone just stopped when Becca spoke? Like they were scared of her. Like fear was the default setting." Jamari nodded against his pillow. He'd seen it, felt it. The school had rules, written and unwritten, spoken and implied, and he was starting to understand that the unwritten ones were the dangerous ones, the ones that decided who belonged and who didn't, the ones that made his mother's position contingent on her silence, the ones that made his existence negotiable. "Mom thinks so too. She said Mr. Wilkins won't let her see the budget reports. Every request gets denied. Every password comes back wrong. Every access point gets blocked." Raya's jaw tightened. "Why would a principal hide money from his own assistant principal? What could he possibly need to keep secret?" Jamari didn't know. But as he held Bravey tighter, feeling the worn fur against his cheek, he felt the first tremor of something shifting, like standing on ice that was just beginning to crack. The sound too quiet to hear, but the sensation impossible to ignore. Outside his window, Meadowbrook Academy sat in darkness, its perfect lawns and pristine buildings hiding something rotten beneath the surface. And Jamari, holding his bear in the dark, wondered how long until the ice broke completely. The announcement came during morning assembly, third day of school. The auditorium was packed, 500 students arranged in perfect rows, uniforms creating a sea of navy and white that looked almost military in its precision. Principal Wilkins stood at the podium like a judge at a bench, his posture rigid, his voice carrying across the space with the weight of absolute authority, each word measured and deliberate. Effective immediately, Meadowbrook Academy is implementing a strict policy regarding personal items in the classroom environment. His pause was theatrical, designed to capture attention, to make everyone lean forward slightly. Students are no longer permitted to bring toys, plushies, stuffed animals, or any non-academic materials that may cause distraction to themselves or to others in the learning environment. Jamari felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward him. Felt them like physical weight, like heat, like hands pressing against his skin. 500 pairs of eyes, and it seemed like all of them knew exactly who this policy was meant for. The girl next to him shifted away. The boy in front turned to stare. Even the teachers seemed to be looking, their faces carefully neutral in that way that meant they knew exactly what was happening, but had chosen not to intervene. Wilkins continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembly but landing, just for a moment, just long enough to be unmistakable, directly on Jamari. "We maintain standards here. Excellence requires focus, discipline, dedication to the academic mission, not comfort objects that belong in elementary school, not in an institution preparing young minds for high school and beyond." The way he said comfort objects made them sound shameful, childish, weak, made Jamari feel shameful, childish, weak, made the anxiety that Bravey helped manage seem like a character flaw instead of a medical condition, made asking for help seem like failure. "This policy applies to all students, no exceptions." Another pointed pause. "Equality means consistent enforcement. We cannot allow some students to follow different rules simply because they claim special circumstances. That would undermine the integrity of our entire institution. The assembly ended with polite applause that felt more like punctuation than praise. As students filed out, Jamari remained seated, Bravey hidden in his backpack, feeling like he was carrying contraband, like he'd become criminal simply by existing in a way that made others uncomfortable. Lorraine didn't bother knocking when she stormed into Wilkins's office 15 minutes later. Her professional composure was cracking, fury seeping through like water through a dam. That policy targets my son. You know Bravey is medical accommodation. His therapist's letter is in his file. This is discrimination, pure and simple. I know nothing of the sort, Mrs. Hayes. Wilkins remained seated, calm as still water before a storm. He didn't even look up from the papers on his desk, the dismissal more insulting than any words could be. I see a toy, a stuffed animal, an object that distracts from learning. Our handbook, which you signed and acknowledged upon accepting your position here, clearly states that academic environments must remain free from distractions. This policy simply clarifies what was always implied. Clarifies? Lorraine's voice rose, despite her best efforts. You announced a new rule 3 days after we arrived. 3 days after meeting my son. You looked directly at him during that announcement. Everyone in that auditorium knew exactly what you were doing. Are you suggesting I created institutional policy based on a single student? Wilkins finally looked up, his expression a perfect mask of professional concern. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hayes. One that suggests you're allowing personal feelings to cloud your professional judgment. That concerns me. It concerns me greatly. Don't. Lorraine's hands clenched. Don't turn this around. My son requires accommodation under federal law. Then file for accommodation. There are proper channels. Paperwork, evaluations by school-approved medical professionals, hearings, reviews, red tape that could take, well, months, maybe longer, given the thoroughness required to ensure we're not setting precedents that could undermine our standards. Wilkins leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Unless you believe your son deserves special treatment, that certain students should be exempt from rules that apply to everyone else? That wouldn't look good for you, Mrs. Hayes. The assistant principal advocating for her own child to receive privileges denied to others. The implication hung between them, ugly and undeniable. Play along or watch your career end. Comply or see your son suffer. Choose between your job and your child's well-being. You're using bureaucracy as a weapon, Lorraine said quietly, the fight draining from her voice, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the trap. You're weaponizing policy to hurt a child. I'm maintaining standards, ensuring consistency, upholding the excellence that makes Meadowbrook Academy the top-performing school in the district. Wilkins returned to his papers, the conversation over by executive decision. I suggest you help your son understand that accommodating his needs does not mean excusing him from expectations. That would be doing him a disservice. Preparation for the real world requires learning that we don't always get what we want, simply because we want it. That night, Jamari sat on his bed while Lorraine knelt in front of him, her hands gentle on his shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that made him understand she'd been crying in the car, in her office, anywhere he couldn't see. Baby, you're going to have to leave Bravey at home for a little while, just until Mama can fix this, just until I can get the proper paperwork processed and approved, and how long? Jamari's voice was barely a whisper, the question loaded with more than just timeline. Lorraine's eyes glistened, tears she refused to let fall. I don't know. I wish I could give you a number, a date, something concrete. But the system, Mr. Wilkins controls the system here, and he's making it as slow and complicated as possible. Because he doesn't want me here. No. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Because he's a small man who uses power to make others smaller, Raya said from the doorway, her jaw set, her hands clenched. This isn't right. Everyone knows that rule was made just to hurt you, made to put you in your place, made to remind you that you don't belong. I know, baby. God, I know. Lorraine stood, squaring her shoulders even as defeat shadowed her face, aging her years in a moment. But Mama's job, if I push too hard right now, if I make too much noise, Wilkins could fire me. Create cause, document insubordination, and then we'd have to leave, find another school, start over again, another new place, another fresh start that isn't really fresh at all. So we just let him win? Raya's voice cracked with frustration, with the helplessness of seeing injustice and being too young, too powerless to stop it. We just let him take whatever he wants? Lorraine's voice was hollow. We pick our battles. And sometimes, baby, sometimes that means losing small fights so we can survive long enough to win bigger wars. That's not fair. That's not right. But that's real. But Jamari wondered, as he placed Bravey on his nightstand with trembling hands, at what point did losing small fights mean you'd already lost everything that mattered? At what point did survival become indistinguishable from surrender? The bear sat on the nightstand, his one good eye staring at Jamari in the darkness, judging him for being too weak to fight back, too scared to stand up, too much of everything that made him wrong, and not enough of anything that made him acceptable. Tomorrow he would go to school without Bravey, would face the hallways and the classrooms and the cafeteria and all those watching eyes without the one thing that made it bearable. Tomorrow he would try to be normal, try to be what they wanted, try to be less, and the trying, he knew, would break something inside him that might never heal. 3 days without Bravey felt like 3 years. 72 hours that stretched and warped until time itself seemed broken. Jamari moved through the hallways like a ghost, translucent and insubstantial, his anxiety a constant hum beneath his skin like electricity running through wires. He'd learned to keep his hands in his pockets so no one would see them shake. Learned to time his breathing so the panic wouldn't show on his face. Learned to make himself smaller, quieter, less. But learning to hide fear doesn't make fear disappear. It just makes it louder on the inside. On Thursday afternoon, Jamari returned to his locker between 3rd and 4th period. The combination stuck. It always did, the old mechanism grinding and resistant. And when he finally yanked it open with both hands, his breath caught. Empty. Completely, impossibly empty. He'd hidden Bravey in the back, wrapped in his gym clothes, buried beneath textbooks he never actually used but carried anyway for weight, for camouflage. Just to have the bear close. Just to know he could see him between classes, even if he couldn't hold him. Even if touching him was against the rules, knowing he was near had been enough. A secret comfort, a small rebellion. But now there was nothing. Just the hollow metal echo of an empty space, the hooks bare, the shelf clean. Even the gym clothes were gone, as if someone had wanted to be thorough, as if someone wanted to erase every trace. No. No, no, no. Jamari's hands shook as he searched through the empty locker, as if Bravey might somehow materialize from nothing, as if reality might rearrange itself if he just looked hard enough. His fingers scraped metal, finding only dust and the ghost of what should have been there. His chest tightened. The hallway tilted. Sounds became sharp and distant all at once, the fluorescent lights too bright, too loud, too much. "Jamari?" A voice cut through the spiral, familiar but distant. "Hey, breathe. What happened?" Ava Martinez stood beside him, concern creasing her face, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not touching. She'd learned from watching him that unexpected touch made it worse. Smart girl. Kind girl. The only person besides Raya who'd spoken to him since the assembly. "He's gone. Bravey's gone. I needed him close, just to see him, and now—" Jamari couldn't finish. The words dissolved into gasps. The panic crashed over him like a wave, 50 feet tall and unstoppable, and he slid down against the lockers, his back scraping metal, his breath coming in short, useless gulps that wouldn't reach his lungs. Ava crouched beside him, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Count with me. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. Come on, Jamari. You've got this. You've done this before." Can't. You can. You are. Feel my hand?" She pressed her palm against the locker beside his head, not touching him, but close enough for him to feel the warmth. "Feel how solid that is? You're solid, too. You're real. This is real. You're okay." By the time Raya found them, summoned by a text from Ava, Jamari had managed to breathe again, but his eyes were red, his face wet, his whole body shaking like he'd been pulled from cold water. "Someone took Bravey," Ava explained quietly, her voice low enough that the gathering crowd of curious students couldn't hear. "From his locker?" Raya's expression shifted from concern to something else, something cold and sharp as winter wind. Her jaw clenched, muscles working beneath the skin. "Did you see who?" Jamari shook his head, the movement small and defeated. "I shouldn't have brought him. I broke the rule. This is my fault. I should have just been normal. Should have just dealt with it. Should have—" "This is not your fault." Raya's voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiral, to pierce the fog of self-blame. She knelt beside him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Someone stole from you. Someone violated your locker, took your property, invaded your space. That's not about rules. That's not about you breaking policy. That's about cruelty. That's about someone deliberately hurting you and knowing exactly how much it would hurt." "Who would—" "Someone who knew," Ava said, her voice thoughtful, analytical. "Think about it. Nobody else even knew he had Bravey in his locker. You were careful. You hid him. So whoever took it knew exactly where to look, knew what taking it would do to you. This wasn't random. This was targeted." That evening, while Jamari lay curled on his bed in that particular stillness that comes after panic exhausts itself, Raya sat with their mother at the kitchen table. Between them lay Raya's laptop, screen glowing in the dimming light, tabs open to the school website, budget documents, news articles about Meadowbrook Academy's supposed excellence. "It wasn't random," Raya said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty earned through hours of digging. "Nobody else even knew he had Bravey in his locker. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing, knew what it would do to him, knew how to hurt him most." Lorraine rubbed her temples, exhaustion making her movements slow. "I've been trying to access the budget reports all week. Every day, new excuses. Wilkins keeps blocking me. Every request denied. Every password mysteriously incorrect. Every access point suddenly under maintenance. It's like he's hiding something, and he's willing to break protocol to keep it hidden." "Maybe he is." Raya pulled up her phone, showing her mother a series of screenshots she'd meticulously collected. Look at the school website. 2 years ago, here, they announced a federal grant for student mental health resources. $250,000 specifically designated for counseling services, therapy programs, anxiety support. Big ceremony. Photos with that giant check. Press release about Meadowbrook's commitment to student wellness. She scrolled through more images. But I asked the guidance counselor today. Casual, like I was just curious about what resources were available. She said they don't have any new programs, no additional counselors, no therapy services, no anxiety support groups, no new anything. Same single counselor they've had for 10 years, same limited services, same nothing. Lorraine's eyes narrowed, prosecutor instincts engaging. Where did the money go? Exactly. Raya pulled up more documents. And it's not just that grant. Look, Technology Improvement Fund, $50,000. New library resources, $30,000. Athletic equipment upgrade, $40,000. All announced, all celebrated, all seemingly vanished. Embezzlement, Lorraine breathed, the word heavy as a stone, or something close to it. Misappropriation at minimum. Raya glanced toward Jamari's closed door, toward her brother grieving a bear that represented more than comfort. And I think Jamari's situation is connected somehow. Why else would Wilkins make that rule? Why specifically target a therapeutic tool? Why ensure my brother is isolated, struggling, visible in his suffering? Distraction, Lorraine said slowly, pieces fitting together. Make the assistant principal's son the problem. Make me focus on protecting Jamari instead of examining the books. Keep me defensive, reactive, too busy fighting small battles to see the bigger war. And if you do find something, Raya continued the thought, he can claim you're biased, vindictive, using your position to retaliate against legitimate discipline of your son. He's building a case against you while you're just trying to protect Jamari. Lorraine was quiet for a long moment, her hands flat on the table, fingers spread wide as if trying to hold something down. Then she straightened her shoulders with the look of someone who'd just made a decision that couldn't be unmade. Tomorrow, I'm getting into those files. One way or another. Her voice carried steel beneath the exhaustion. He doesn't know that I was a forensic accountant before I went into education, that I've traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts, that I know every trick in the book for hiding financial crimes. Be careful, Raya warned. If he catches you, he won't, because I'm not going to give him the chance to see me coming. But neither of them knew, as they sat planning in the kitchen light, that Bravey wasn't lost at all. The bear sat in Principal Wilkins' desk drawer at that very moment, his one good eye staring up at darkness, imprisoned like evidence of control, like proof of power over the smallest, most vulnerable targets, like a trophy taken from someone too weak to fight back. Wilkins kept it there deliberately, a reminder to himself of his authority, of his ability to take anything from anyone, of the fact that in his school, in his domain, even a child's comfort could be revoked at will. He'd taken the bear himself, using his master key during third period while Jamari was in class, had wrapped it carefully in the boy's gym clothes, had locked it away like a secret, like a sin, like something shameful that needed to be hidden. But shame, like truth, has a way of coming to light. Jamari stopped speaking entirely. Not just the nervous quiet he usually carried, the careful rationing of words to conserve energy, the selective silence of someone choosing their moments. This was different. Complete. Total. A withdrawal so profound that even Raya began to worry it might be permanent. He moved through classes like a shadow, present but not there, his body occupying space while his mind retreated to somewhere unreachable. He answered attendance with raised hand instead of voice, communicated through headshakes and nods, turned in written work without a single spoken word. His teachers noticed. Of course they noticed, but their concern manifested as careful distance, as if his silence might be contagious, as if engaging might somehow make them responsible for whatever was breaking inside him. Even Becca Wilkins noticed, though she only smiled wider at the victory. She'd pass him in hallways and whisper just loud enough for him to hear, "Lost your voice along with your teddy bear? That's sad." Her friends would laugh on cue, their mockery a practiced performance. But Jamari had gone somewhere beyond their reach, beyond hurt, beyond caring. He'd found that place inside himself where nothing could touch him because he'd stopped being touchable, stopped being present, stopped being anything but a shell moving through the motions of existence. It was Ava who broke through. She found him at lunch on Friday, sitting alone at the corner table, the same spot where Bravey used to sit beside his tray, now painfully empty. She didn't ask permission, just slid into the seat across from him with her lunch tray and a determination that suggested she'd made up her mind about something. "I know who took your bear," she said quietly, without preamble, without gentle let-in. Jamari's eyes lifted. For the first time in days, something flickered in them. Hope, anger, fear, a mixture of all three creating something that looked almost like life. Ava glanced around, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Becca told me. Well, she didn't mean to tell me, but I was in the bathroom when she came in with her friends. They didn't see me in the stall. She was bragging about how her dad had personally removed it from your locker, how he'd used his master key during third period, how keeping it from you was teaching you an important lesson about following rules." Jamari's hands clenched under the table. His voice, unused for days, came out raw and scratchy, barely recognizable. "Why?" "Because you wouldn't stop bringing it to school. Because you kept hiding it in your locker even after the rule. Becca said her dad wanted to teach you a lesson about consequences, about understanding that his rules aren't suggestions." Ava's voice dropped even lower. "But there's more, Jamari. She said anyone caught being friends with you would face consequences, real consequences, detention, suspension, academic probation, whatever it takes to keep you isolated. They've been threatening students, warning them to stay away from you or face disciplinary action." The words should have hurt, should have driven Jamari further into silence, deeper into that safe place where nothing mattered because caring about anything only led to pain. Instead, something shifted. A small crack in the wall of fear, a hairline fracture that let light through. "Why are you telling me this?" Jamari asked, his voice gaining strength with each word, like muscles remembering how to work. "If they'll punish you. Because it's wrong." Ava met his eyes steadily, unflinching. "And because my parents taught me that staying silent about wrong things makes you part of the problem. That witnessing injustice and doing nothing is the same as supporting it. I can handle detention. I can handle suspension. What I can't handle is looking at myself in the mirror knowing I was too scared to do the right thing." Something in her words resonated, echoed. Because Jamari had been silent, and that silence hadn't protected him, had only made him smaller, had only given Wilkins more power. That night, while Jamari processed everything Ava had told him, turned it over in his mind like a puzzle with missing pieces, Lorraine sat at her computer staring at the screen with the intensity of someone solving an equation that would determine everything. She'd finally cracked Wilkins' password. Not through sophisticated hacking or technical expertise, but through patient observation and the arrogance of powerful men. He'd used his daughter's birthday, simple, predictable. The kind of password that suggested he'd never imagined anyone would dare try to access his files. And now, the school's financial records sprawled before her like a confession written in numbers and dates and carefully hidden transactions. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words barely audible even in the quiet of her home office. Raya appeared at her shoulder, drawn by the tone of her mother's voice. "What is it?" "The mental health grant, the technology fund, the scholarship program, the athletic improvements, the library renovation." Lorraine's finger traced down the screen, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs that told a story of systematic theft. All of it, every single dollar, diverted to a single construction company, Wilkins Construction and Design. Related to the principal? "His brother-in-law owns it, and look at this." Lorraine clicked through more files, years of carefully constructed fraud unfolding like a road map. Multiple contracts for school improvements, a new gymnasium we don't have, updated computer labs that were never installed, classroom renovations that never happened, athletic equipment that was never purchased. Every contract approved by Wilkins, paid by the school, work allegedly completed by his brother-in-law's company, except none of the work was ever actually done. "How much?" Raya's voice was hollow, already understanding the magnitude. Lorraine's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up a summary document. "Over 3 years? $473,000, nearly $500,000, embezzled from programs meant to help students like Jamari. Money that should have gone to counselors, therapists, support services, stolen and funneled into Wilkins' family's pockets." Raya was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "The school board meets next week." "They do. Are you going to tell them?" Lorraine looked at her daughter, then toward Jamari's room, where her son sat in that silence that had become his armor and his prison. She thought about the bear locked away in Wilkins' desk, about the policy designed to isolate one child, about the systematic way power had been weaponized against the vulnerable. "I'm going to do more than tell them," Lorraine said, steel entering her voice. "I'm going to show them everything, every transaction, every falsified invoice, every lie documented in his own emails. But we need proof Wilkins can't deny, hard evidence, documentation, and we need allies. We need people willing to speak up, to corroborate, to stand with us even when it's dangerous." She pulled up another file, emails Wilkins had deleted but not permanently erased, living in a digital purgatory where they thought they were safe. Communications with the construction company discussing payment schedules, falsified invoices with identical formatting errors, explicit instructions to hide expenditures from board oversight, to classify obvious fraud as legitimate expenses. "This is enough," Raya breathed, reading over her mother's shoulder. "This is enough to destroy him," Lorraine corrected, her voice measured. "But we have to be smart, strategic. He's powerful, connected, part of this community's fabric. If we move too soon, if we show our hand before we're ready, he'll bury this and us with it. He'll manufacture evidence of misconduct on my part, create cause for termination, discredit us before we can discredit him." The door to Jamari's room opened. He stood there, backlit by the hallway light, Ava's words still ringing in his ears. His voice, when he spoke, was stronger than it had been in days. "I want to speak." Both women turned, surprise evident on their faces. At the board meeting, Jamari continued, stepping into the room, his posture straightening with each word. I want to tell them what he did. About the rule, about Bravey, about the threats, about all of it, about how he made me disappear from my own life. Lorraine's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Baby, you don't have to do this. This is adult business. You've been through enough. Yes, I do. Jamari's voice didn't waver. If I stay quiet, he wins. If I hide, he wins. If I let fear control me, then he's already won. Ava was right. Silence makes you part of the problem, and I'm done being part of the problem. I'm done being silent while someone steals from kids like me. I'm done pretending it's okay to be treated like I don't matter. He looked at his mother, then at his sister, then at the computer screen displaying evidence of Wilkins' crimes. You have the numbers. You have the proof. But they need to see what those numbers mean. They need to see the face of the kid who didn't get help because Wilkins stole the money meant to help him. They need to hear from someone who was hurt, who is still being hurt. For the first time since moving to Meadowbrook, Jamari looked like he was standing on solid ground, like he'd found something underneath the fear. Not the absence of fear, that would come later, if ever, but something stronger than fear, something that could coexist with fear and still move forward. Purpose. Then we do this together, Lorraine said, her voice thick with emotion. As a family, all three of us. Raya put her hand on Jamari's shoulder. They're not going to know what hit them. But Jamari was already thinking about the words he would say, about the story he would tell, about standing in front of strangers and making them understand what it felt like to be erased, to be targeted, to be deemed unacceptable simply for existing as himself. He was terrified, but he was done letting terror make his decisions. The school board meeting room felt too small for what was about to happen, too cramped, too ordinary, the kind of space where budget approvals and curriculum changes were discussed in measured tones, where conflicts were resolved through parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order. Not the kind of space built for revelations, for confrontations, for the systematic dismantling of someone's carefully constructed empire. Parents filled the seats in uneven rows, some dressed for work, still in business attire, others in casual clothes suggesting they'd rushed from dinner. Teachers lined the walls like witnesses at a trial, their faces carefully neutral, but their presence telling. They'd come to watch something, though most probably didn't know what. At the front, behind a long table that seemed designed to create distance between power and people, sat the 7 board members. Principal Wilkins sat to the right, positioned slightly apart as if his status required physical separation. He was composed, confident, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who'd sat through hundreds of these meetings and emerged unscathed every time. His daughter Becca sat beside him in the front row, her presence a silent statement of family solidarity, of unified power. Lorraine approached the podium, a flash drive clutched in her hand like a weapon, like evidence, like the key to a door that, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Members of the board, thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. Her voice was steady, professional, but underneath ran a current of barely controlled fury. What I'm about to share will disturb you. It disturbed me. It should disturb anyone who cares about the integrity of this institution and the welfare of the students we're meant to serve. But our students deserve better than silence. They deserve better than complicity masked as professionalism. She inserted the flash drive with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a spreadsheet that looked innocuous until you understood what the numbers meant. Over the past 3 years, Meadowbrook Academy has received over $450,000 in grants and donations, money designated specifically for student mental health resources, technology upgrades, scholarship programs, and facility improvements. She clicked to the next slide. Emails, bank transfers, contracts with telltale signatures. None of these programs exist. The technology was never purchased. The scholarships were never awarded. The mental health services were never implemented. The money was systematically diverted through fraudulent contracts to a construction company owned by Principal Wilkins' brother-in-law. The murmurs started immediately, rippling through the room like wind through grass. Parents leaning toward each other. Teachers exchanging glances. Board members sitting forward in their chairs, expressions shifting from polite attention to sharp focus. Wilkins stood, his face calm but his jaw tight, muscles working beneath the skin. Mrs. Hayes, these are serious accusations without... I have proof. Lorraine's voice cut through his like a blade through cloth, sharp and clean. Deleted emails that weren't permanently erased, falsified invoices with identical formatting errors across multiple vendors, bank transfers showing money moving from school accounts to Wilkins Construction and Design, communications where you explicitly instructed your secretary to hide these transactions from board oversight, to classify obvious fraud as legitimate expenses, to obstruct any attempt at financial review. She clicked through slides methodically, each one another nail in the coffin. Email screenshots with timestamps. Transaction records with account numbers. Invoices for work that was never completed. Equipment that was never delivered. Improvements that existed only on paper. The room erupted. Not gradually, but all at once. Parents calling out questions, voices overlapping, board members demanding order while simultaneously demanding answers, teachers whispering to each other with the shocked recognition of people who'd suspected something but never had proof. But through it all, through the chaos and accusation and rising anger, Jamari sat in the back row, Bravey clutched against his chest. The bear had been found that morning, discovered by a custodian named Marcus, who'd witnessed the principal lock it in his desk drawer days earlier. Marcus had waited, had watched, had finally worked up the courage to retrieve it and return it to its rightful owner. Now the bear sat in Jamari's arms, evidence made physical, proof that everything Lorraine was saying was true. Wilkins tried again, his voice rising to be heard over the crowd. This is a witch hunt, a vindictive attack by an employee who discovered systematic theft of funds meant to help vulnerable students. Lorraine held up her hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone who'd finally stopped being afraid. But that's not all, because the financial crimes, as serious as they are only half the story. Principal Wilkins has created an environment of fear and discrimination at this school. He's targeted students, particularly students of color, students with disabilities, students who don't fit his narrow definition of acceptable, with arbitrary rules designed to isolate and humiliate them. She gestured to Jamari, and every eye in the room turned to see the small black boy in the back, the bear pressed against his chest like a shield. My son, who suffers from clinically diagnosed anxiety disorder, was prohibited from using his therapeutic support item, a support item recommended by his doctor, documented in his medical files, protected under federal accommodation law. When he tried to keep it nearby in his locker, not in class, just nearby, it was confiscated and hidden in the principal's desk as a form of psychological punishment. That's absurd, Wilkins interjected. but his voice had lost some of its certainty. We have policies, legitimate policies. You created a policy specifically to target my son. Lorraine's composure cracked slightly, the mother breaking through the professional facade. A policy announced 3 days after we arrived at this school, 3 days after meeting Jamari, 3 days after seeing him with Bravey. The timing wasn't coincidence. The wording, toys and comfort objects, wasn't generic. It was surgical, designed to exclude legitimate medical accommodations by categorizing them as childish distractions. She took a breath, steadying herself, rebuilding the professional armor. But don't take my word for it. Don't rely on my interpretation or my bias as a mother. My son would like to speak. Jamari stood. The room, which had been loud with argument and accusation, fell silent. Every eye turned to him. This small boy with his bear. This child who'd been made to feel ashamed for needing help. This victim of cruelty disguised as policy. His legs shook as he walked down the aisle. His hands trembled around Bravey. The microphone at the podium loomed before him like a mountain, like an impossible obstacle, like everything that had ever terrified him compressed into a single moment of expectation. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The words were there, pressing against his throat like birds against glass, but fear held them hostage. The room waited. Patient, expectant, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Then he looked at Bravey, at the worn fur and crooked eye, at the poorly sewn seam and the stuffing that peeked through, at this small thing that had been deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, wrong, simply because it helped him exist. "My name is Jamari Hayes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but amplified by the microphone into something that filled the room. "I'm 12 years old, and I have anxiety, social anxiety, panic disorder. It's not something I chose. It's not something I can just stop. It's part of me, like my eye color or my height or the fact that I'm black. Bravey helps me. He's not just a toy. He's not a distraction. He's how I get through the day when everything feels too big, too loud, too much." He looked up at Wilkins, making himself meet those eyes that had looked at him with such contempt. "Principal Wilkins made a rule to take him away. Not because Bravey was causing problems, not because I was disrupting class or bothering other students, but because seeing me need help made him uncomfortable. Because I reminded him of something he didn't want in his perfect school. Because I am black and anxious and different, and that didn't fit the image he wanted Meadowbrook to have." Someone in the crowd gasped. Others nodded, the truth settling over them like weight. "You made a rule to hurt me," Jamari continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, fear transforming into something else, something harder and brighter and more powerful. "You stole Bravey to punish me for existing as myself, for needing accommodation, for being disabled and black and visible. And then you told other kids they couldn't be my friend or they'd get in trouble too. You isolated me, on purpose, systematically. You made sure I understood that I didn't belong, that I wasn't welcome, that my very existence was wrong." He turned to the board, to the parents, to the teachers, to everyone who'd come to witness. "I'm not the only one. Ava Martinez told me other kids are scared too. Scared to speak up, scared to be different, scared to need help, scared that if they don't fit some perfect picture, they'll be next. They'll be targeted. They'll be made to feel like they don't deserve to be here." Jamari's voice broke, but he pushed through, words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "You stole money meant to help kids like me. $400,000 that should have gone to counselors, to therapy programs, to support services for students who are struggling. And then, when one of those students showed up with the one thing that actually helped him. You took that too. You stole from me twice. Once with the money that could have given me real help, and once with the bear that was helping me survive without it. He stepped back from the microphone. Bravey pressed tight against his chest, his whole body shaking but his eyes dry. He'd said it. All of it. The truth that had been choking him for weeks. The room was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then one person started clapping. A parent in the middle row, standing as she applauded. Then another joined. Then 3 more. Then a wave of applause washed through the space. Parents and teachers standing, the sound building like a storm, like thunder, like vindication made audible. Wilkins remained seated, his face drained of color, of confidence, of everything that had made him seem untouchable. A board member, Dr. Patricia Chen, the superintendent, spoke, her voice cutting through the applause. "Principal Wilkins, you are suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. This body will review every piece of evidence presented tonight, and I'm calling for an emergency session tomorrow to discuss interim leadership and student protection protocols." She turned to the room, to the security officers who'd quietly entered during Jamari's testimony. This had gone beyond board jurisdiction the moment the word embezzlement was spoken. "Officers, please escort Mr. Wilkins from the building. The district attorney's office has been notified. I expect criminal charges will be filed within 48 hours. As officers approached, professionally, carefully, but unmistakably there to remove him, Becca stood, tears streaming down her face, watching her father's empire crumble, watching the power she'd wielded evaporate, watching her world rearrange itself around a truth she'd helped hide. But Jamari wasn't watching Wilkins being led away in disgrace. He was looking at his mother, at Raya, at Ava in the crowd who was smiling through her own tears, her face saying without words, "You did it," he'd spoken. And the world hadn't ended. It had changed. The investigation moved with the swift efficiency of a house of cards collapsing. Once the first piece of evidence emerged, the rest followed with inevitable momentum. What Wilkins had spent years carefully constructing, layer upon layer of fraud, each transaction hidden beneath legitimate-looking paperwork, unraveled in days. A janitor came forward first. Marcus, the same man who'd returned Bravey, testified that Wilkins had ordered him to disable security cameras in the administrative wing on specific days. Days that, when cross-referenced with bank records, aligned perfectly with large cash deposits. Days when Wilkins' brother-in-law would visit, leaving with checks that supposedly paid for construction work that never materialized. Then came Gloria, the secretary who'd worked at Meadowbrook for 15 years. She produced a second set of books she'd been forced to maintain, hidden in her home office because she was terrified, but couldn't quite bring herself to destroy evidence. Books that showed the real expenses versus the fabricated ones. The actual modest improvements versus the inflated contracts. The truth behind the lies. Parents of scholarship students discovered their children's aid had been denied, while Wilkins reported it as distributed. Money meant for a young girl's tutoring had paid for granite countertops in his kitchen. Funds designated for a boys' college prep program had bought his wife a car. Hundreds of small thefts that added up to massive betrayal. Each revelation brought more witnesses. Teachers who'd been told to ignore policy violations by favored families. Students who'd been punished for reporting bullying when the bullies were connected to donors. A custodian who'd seen Wilkins taking supplies, computers, printers, athletic equipment, and loading them into his personal vehicle late at night. 2 weeks after the board meeting, criminal charges were filed. Not just embezzlement, fraud, witness intimidation, theft, tax evasion. Because of course he hadn't reported the stolen money as income. Each charge another weight pulling him down. The DA's press conference was brief but devastating. This investigation has revealed systematic abuse of power spanning at least 5 years, possibly longer. We're estimating total theft exceeding $600,000 when we include unreported incidents. This case represents a profound violation of public trust and the exploitation of children for personal gain. The school transformed overnight, like a house that had been holding its breath for years, windows closed, doors locked, air growing stale and thick, suddenly exhaling, opening, breathing. Lorraine was appointed interim principal within 48 hours of Wilkins' suspension. Her first act was to rescind every discriminatory policy he'd implemented. The ban on comfort objects was replaced with comprehensive accommodation protocols. The unwritten rules about who could befriend whom evaporated. The culture of fear that had made students afraid to be themselves began to dissolve. Her second act was to establish an actual mental health program, funded by the recovered embezzled money and new grants from donors who'd heard Jamari's story and been moved to action. 2 full-time counselors were hired. A quiet room was created where students could decompress. Support groups for anxiety, depression, grief, and trauma were organized. Everything that should have existed all along but hadn't, because one man had stolen the resources meant to create it. Becca Wilkins withdrew from Meadowbrook 3 days after her father's arrest. Some said her mother enrolled her in a private school 2 counties away, desperate to escape the shadow of her husband's crimes and her daughter's complicity. Others said they'd moved states, changing names, trying to disappear into anonymity. A few claimed they'd seen her at the courthouse, visiting her father, but no one could confirm it. The cheer squad held emergency elections. The captain approached Raya not to replace anyone, but to join as co-captain and help rebuild the squad's culture from the ground up. "We want it to be about support, not power," Emma, the captain, explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd participated in a toxic system and was trying to make amends. About lifting people up, not holding them down, about celebrating our school, not enforcing some hierarchy of who matters more. Raya accepted, but with conditions. No more targeting people for being different. No more using our position to make others feel small. And if I see anyone bullying in the name of school spirit, I'm calling it out. Publicly. Emma nodded. "That's exactly why we need you." One afternoon, in late October, Jamari walked into the library and stopped short. There was a new display case that hadn't been there before, positioned prominently near the entrance where everyone would see it. Inside sat Bravey, positioned carefully on a small velvet cushion, treated with the dignity of a museum artifact. A brass plaque beneath the case read, "Bravey, symbol of courage in vulnerability. Reminder that asking for help is strength, not weakness. That being different is not wrong. That accommodation is right. Donated by Jamari Hayes, who showed us that the smallest voices can speak the loudest truths." "I didn't donate him," Jamari said to Mrs. Chen, the librarian who was shelving books nearby. She smiled, kind wrinkles forming at the corners of her eyes. "Your mother suggested it. She thought Bravey had done his job for you, and maybe he could help others now. Give them permission to need what they need. Show them that support isn't shameful." She paused. "But if you need him back, if you still need him, this case opens. He's still yours, always will be." "No." Jamari looked at the bear through the glass, at the worn fur and crooked eye, at this thing that had carried him through his darkest moments. He's right where he belongs. Because Bravey wasn't just his anymore. The bear had become something larger than one boy's comfort object. He'd become a testament to every student who'd ever been told their needs were inconvenient, their differences were defects, their existence was negotiable. He'd become proof that speaking up, even when terrified, even when your voice shakes, even when you're small and scared and everything in you screams to stay silent, could change the world. Ava found Jamari there, standing in front of the display case like it was a memorial to something that had died so something else could live. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle with understanding. Jamari nodded slowly. "I kept thinking about what you said, about silence making you part of the problem." He turned to face her. "I was silent for so long, so scared that if I spoke up, I'd make things worse, that my voice didn't matter, that I didn't matter. And now? Now I know that being quiet was making things worse, just differently. It was letting Wilkins keep stealing, keep hurting, keep destroying. My silence protected him, not me." He looked back at Bravey, at this symbol of vulnerability made strength. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying strong alone. It's asking for help. It's speaking up even when you're terrified. It's admitting you need support and refusing to be ashamed of that need." That evening, the local news ran a follow-up story about Wilkins' arrest and the school's transformation. They interviewed Jamari, though he was filmed from behind to protect his privacy as a minor. His voice disguised slightly, but his words clear and powerful. "What would you say to other kids who are scared to speak up?" the reporter asked, her voice professional but gentle. Jamari was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, "I'd say that your voice matters, even if it shakes, even if you're scared, especially if you're scared. Because the people who want to silence you, the bullies, the corrupt principals, the ones who benefit from your fear, they're counting on that fear. They're betting you'll be too afraid to fight back. Don't let them have that power. Don't let fear make you invisible." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I'd say that needing help doesn't make you weak. Asking for accommodation doesn't make you less than. Being different isn't wrong. The world will tell you otherwise. People in power will try to make you feel ashamed for not being what they want you to be. But they're wrong. And proving them wrong starts with refusing to believe their lies about you." The segment ended with a shot of Bravey in the display case, his one good eye catching the library light, looking almost alive, almost knowing. The case had a small donation box beside it now. Money collected would go to the school's new mental health fund. Within a week, it had raised over $2,000. Students, parents, teachers, all contributing not just money, but stories. Notes about their own struggles with anxiety, depression, trauma, testimonials about times they'd needed help and been too ashamed to ask, promises to do better, to be kinder, to see vulnerability as humanity rather than weakness. Bravey, it seemed, was still helping people, still making the world a little bit safer for those who needed safety. Spring arrived at Meadowbrook Academy like a second beginning, like the world remembered how to be gentle. The cherry trees along the main walkway bloomed pink and white, petals drifting through the air like small promises, like confetti celebrating something unnamed but deeply felt. The building itself seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of secrets and lies had been pressing down on the very foundation, and their removal had allowed everything to rise a few inches, to breathe a little easier. Jamari walked through those trees without fear, without the constant calculation of which route would attract the least attention, which hallway would have the fewest eyes, which door would let him slip in unnoticed. He walked like someone who belonged, because he did. Because the school had finally become a place where belonging wasn't conditional on erasure. He'd made friends, real ones, the kind built on genuine connection rather than social necessity or strategic alliance. Ava, of course, who'd started the Anxiety Support Club and invited Jamari to help lead it, who met every Tuesday after school in the library, where they shared strategies and stories and the simple relief of not being alone. Marcus from math class, a quiet white boy with ADHD who also struggled with speaking up and found solidarity in Jamari's story, who'd said one day, "You made it okay for me to need help, too." Even some of the former Becca followers had apologized. Real apologies. Not the performative kind. Girls who'd laughed when Jamari was mocked now sat with him at lunch sometimes, tentative at first, then gradually more comfortable. One of them, Sarah, had pulled him aside last week and said, "I was scared of Becca. Scared if I didn't go along with her, I'd be next. That's not an excuse, but I want you to know, I'm sorry. And I'm trying to be braver now. Like you were." The school felt different. Or maybe Jamari felt different in it. Maybe both. Maybe the transformation was mutual, reciprocal, each changing the other until the line between them blurred. He still visited Bravey in the library. Not every day anymore, but regularly. Like visiting an old friend who'd moved away, but whose impact remained. The bear sat in his display case with quiet dignity, and students would stop to read the plaque, to drop notes or money in the donation box, to stand quietly for a moment as if in the presence of something sacred. One Tuesday afternoon, as Jamari was heading to Anxiety Support Club, a new student appeared in the library doorway. She was small, maybe 9 years old, with dark skin and braided hair and eyes that darted around the unfamiliar space like a trapped bird looking for escape. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, white fur with floppy ears and a pink nose, held so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Jamari recognized that grip, that fear, that desperate need for something soft in a world that felt too hard. He approached slowly, carefully, announcing his presence with a gentle, "Hi, I'm Jamari. Are you new here?" She nodded, not speaking, her whole body tense like a string pulled too tight. "It's okay to be scared," Jamari said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd walked this path before. "I was terrified when I first got here. Couldn't speak without my heart trying to jump out of my chest. Couldn't get through a day without—" He gestured to Bravey in the display case. "That's my bear. His name is Bravey. I brought him to school every day because I needed him to feel safe." The girl looked at the bear, then back at Jamari, her eyes widening slightly with something that might have been recognition, might have been hope. "They let you bring him?" Her voice was so quiet it was almost not there. "It wasn't easy," Jamari admitted, and there was history in those words, weight and struggle and pain overcome. "Some people tried to make me feel bad about needing help, tried to take him away, tried to make me believe that asking for support was wrong, was weakness, was something to be ashamed of. But I learned something important. There's nothing wrong with needing help. Nothing wrong with being different. Nothing wrong with being exactly who you are, even if who you are includes needing a little extra support sometimes." The girl's grip on her rabbit loosened slightly. Just a fraction, but enough to notice. "What's your rabbit's name?" Jamari asked. "Daisy." Her voice was still barely audible, but it was there. Present. Real. "That's a beautiful name. You can bring Daisy to class if you need to. The principal, that's my mom now, actually. She made sure the rules protect kids like us. Kids who just need a little extra help sometimes. Kids who are brave enough to ask for what they need instead of suffering in silence. The girl's eyes widened further. Your mom is the principal? Jamari smiled, and it was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that smiles hadn't for a long time. Yeah, she's pretty great. She fought really hard to make this school safe for everyone, to make it a place where being different isn't wrong, where needing accommodation isn't weakness, where asking for help is encouraged instead of punished. And if anyone gives you trouble about Daisy, any teacher, any student, anyone, you tell me or my mom or any adult here, okay? You have rights, you have protection, you matter. She nodded, a small smile forming at the corners of her mouth, tentative but real. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, approached with a book in her hands. I thought you might like this, she said to the girl, her voice warm as sunlight. It's about a brave rabbit who helps her friends overcome their fears, who teaches them that being scared doesn't mean you can't be courageous. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. As the girl settled into a beanbag chair to read, Jamari stood near Bravey's case one more time. The bear sat in quiet dignity, transformed from personal necessity to public symbol. No longer a crutch or a secret shame, but a reminder that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that needing help wasn't failure, that sometimes the bravest thing was simply admitting you couldn't do it alone. The afternoon sun streamed through the library windows, catching dust motes in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. Jamari watched the new girl read, watched her slowly relax, watched Daisy become less of a shield and more of a companion. Raya found him there 20 minutes later. Ready to go home? Yeah. Jamari took one last look at Bravey. Thanks, buddy. As they walked out into the spring afternoon, Lorraine was standing in the main hallway talking to a group of parents about the new mental health initiatives. She looked up, saw her children, and smiled, the kind of smile that held pride and love and hard-won peace. The kind of smile that said, we made it, we survived. We did more than survive. We changed things. The school around them hummed with the normal chaos of dismissal, lockers slamming, voices calling out, laughter echoing through hallways. The sounds of a building full of life, of students who felt safe enough to be loud, to be present, to be themselves. But underneath the chaos was something new. Something Jamari could feel in the way students greeted each other, in the way teachers interacted, in the way the building itself seemed to breathe easier, an atmosphere of acceptance, of safety, of belonging that didn't require anyone to be smaller than they were. Not because someone powerful had granted it as a favor, but because people who'd been powerless had demanded it as a right, had spoken up when silence was safer, had fought back when compliance was easier, had refused to let fear write the final chapter of their story. Jamari didn't need Bravey anymore. Not clutched against his chest in the hallways, not hidden in his locker as contraband, not as a daily necessity for survival, but knowing the bear was there, visible, honored, helping others the way he'd once helped Jamari. That was enough. That was everything. Because some things you carry with you every step of your journey, their weight both burden and blessing. And some things you set down carefully, deliberately, in a place where others can find them when they need them most, where your struggle can become someone else's roadmap, where your pain can transform into someone else's permission to ask for help. Jamari had learned to do both, had learned when to hold on and when to let go. had learned that strength wasn't always about carrying everything alone. Sometimes strength was knowing what to share, what to give away, what to make available to those who would come after. As they stepped outside into the spring sunshine, Raya bumped his shoulder gently. "You know what Mom told me this morning? That Wilkins pleaded guilty, full confession. He's going to prison for at least 5 years. Jamari processed this quietly. "Good," he said finally. Not with satisfaction or vindictiveness, but with the simple recognition that justice, however imperfect, had arrived. "Does this mean it's really over?" "The legal part? Almost. But what you started, what you changed here, that's just beginning." Raya looked back at the school, at the building that had once felt like enemy territory, and now felt like home. "You know how many schools have reached out to Mom, asking her to help them review their policies, to audit their finances, to create actual support programs instead of just talking about them. You did that. Your voice did that." Jamari shook his head slightly. "We did it. You, Mom, Ava, Marcus the custodian, Mrs. Chen, everyone who spoke up. One voice alone just gets silenced. But when we spoke together, we became impossible to ignore," Raya finished. "Yeah, that's the truth." They walked home through streets that felt more familiar now, through a neighborhood that had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like theirs. Behind them, Meadowbrook Academy sat in the afternoon light, transformed from a place of fear into a place of possibility. And in the library, in a display case near the entrance, Bravey kept watch, one crooked eye seeing everything, bearing witness to the truth that the smallest among us can speak the loudest truths. That vulnerability, when given voice, becomes power. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's revolution. Some victories come through force, others through strategy. But the most lasting transformations come through courage to be honest about need, about struggle, about the simple human requirement for support and understanding and grace. Jamari had found that courage in the form of a worn, stuffed bear, and he'd shared it with a world that desperately needed the reminder that none of us are meant to face our battles alone.